Good morning. The story of the day clearly is ICMR Zero survey, which tells us that about 1 crore Indians have at some point or the other in their lives been affected by the coronavirus. Now, essentially, what a Zero survey is that every person's body develops antibodies to fight off any infection. So, what the survey does is that it takes your blood, it takes your blood sample, and it sees if you have those antibodies. And if you have the antibody, it concludes that you must have had the coronavirus. Now, that's very very good news for a variety of reasons. Here, one, it tells you that the virus itself is not that strong. If 1 crore people could have the virus and then get okay, didn't even know about it, so that's good news. The other way to look at it is that this number is about 35 times more than the number which is officially reported by the government of India and various state governments every day. At the time when the survey was done, the infection levels in India were even lower. So actually, the number may be about 50 to 50 times lower than what we thought the corona infections are. Now that's very good news for a variety of reasons. Essentially, what it means is that every number that you are worried about, the number of people who need to be hospitalized, the number of people who need ventilators, the number of people who die due to corona, all those rates have essentially got to be divided by about 50 to 55 times. So to give you one example, the case fatality rate, which is the number of people who die as a proportion of the number of people who report the coronavirus, that's about 2.8% right now. Now, when you look at the number of deaths, which is around 9,000, you divide that by 1 crore people who've been infected, and you get an infection mortality rate of about 0.08, which is really low. And it essentially tells you that there's no reason to fear the coronavirus in the manner that you have. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and these kind of cities are out of trouble, or that hospital beds are not running out, or ventilators are not running out. They are, but that's a separate story. In fact, the cabinet secretary had a briefing yesterday on the preparedness of various state governments, and he said that a lot of them would run out of ventilators on various days. He's given the dates, the ventilators, the hospital beds, the ICUs, and hopefully, as we've been recommending for some time, in some of these cities, the army will be called out and asked to build up field hospitals very quickly, so that people don't run out of beds, and the government can actually deal with the coronavirus quickly. An interesting story in this connection is the Delhi government had tried to convert various hotels, I keep getting this wrong. The Delhi government had tried to convert various hotels into hospitals, and some of these hotels went to the court, and the Delhi High Court has now set up a panel which is actually going to look at whether the recommendation even makes sense, whether it is viable to convert these hotels into hospitals. So the Delhi government's attempt to create more capacity has hit yet another roadblock. In fact, our second editorial today discusses some of these lessons that the Delhi government can learn from Mumbai, whether it's in terms of create more capacity, whether it's quarantining people effectively. We've seen what a wonderful job the authorities have managed to do so far in Dharavi. So hopefully the Delhi government will take some lessons from their counterparts, in Maharashtra as far as Mumbai is concerned. While most people have been worried about migrants taking back the infection and rural India also getting very infected just like urban India is, we have some good news here. We've actually mapped the virus affected districts. We've mapped this with census data, and we basically come up with, we've been able to classify districts into rural, semi-urban, and urban, and we've tried to figure out that how much of the infection is in rural areas, how much has this grown over a period of time, and the results, frankly, are quite encouraging. We find that about 19% of the total number of infected people in India right now are living in rural and semi-urban areas, and this is roughly the same number that state governments like Andhra Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh are putting out, because they put out some data in terms of how much of their infections are coming from the migrants who've come back. We don't have data for Bihar as yet for some reason, but hopefully, presumably also it will tell you the same story here. So the infections in rural India are rising, but they have not been rising, they're not alarming as yet. And 17-18% infection levels in rural and semi-urban areas is quite all right. The sad story is that, that was good news I told you. The sad story is the AGR saga just continues to be exactly where it was. The courts are continuing with their old stance, of saying that you have to pay the money. The government is continuing to do, well, nothing. It's been doing nothing for 6 years, and it continues to do that. So that is really unfortunate story. Briefly, the case is about a dispute about what exactly is revenue. So because telecom companies pay a revenue share to the government, so what is revenue is? So the case has been going on since about 2004 or 5 or thereabouts. Until recently, there was no actual conclusion on what was revenue. The telecom companies had won some of the cases that they fought in court. The government had won some. So it just went on. I mean, there was no clarity. So as a result of this, basically, like the government at some point, for example, said that even the interest that telecom companies earn on their deposits, even that should be considered to be, telecom revenue. Now that's clearly absurd, but that's the way the discussion went on. So while this dispute was going on, the government would every quarter, send demand notes to the telecom companies. This would have the due for that quarter. It would have the penalty on the previous dues, the interest upon the interest, and it is basically the dues itself were small, the interest upon interest and the penalties became very, very large. And that saga continued till, from 2004 or 5 till now. So that's a huge amount of money. So when the Supreme Court finally decided and said what was to be considered revenue, now that's okay. You can agree or disagree with the Supreme Court's definition, that doesn't matter. But when the Supreme Court decided on what actually is revenue, that was the first actual definition of revenue, of telecom revenue. So ideally, all the the penalties and the interest and stuff like that should have been that shouldn't have been taken into account. But for whatever reason, the Supreme Court decided on what revenue was only recently, and despite that, all the interest and the penalties that the Department of Telecom had levied, it asked the telecom companies to pay that as well. Now that is clearly very unfair, because if you look at that table, about 75% of the dues, of the AGR dues, the so-called dues, are actually interest and penalty and interest upon interest. So if the Supreme Court just asked the telecom companies to pay the principal amount, frankly, we wouldn't have the problem that we're talking about, right now. Now, based on whatever you're hearing, whatever the companies are telling us, Airtel will be able to manage. They've raised some fresh money. They've paid some amount of money. They'll pay the rest. Vodafone clearly is not going to be able to pay the amount of money. And that's going to be a problem, because Vodafone owes the banks of India 50,000 crores. 50,000 crores. It owes the government another 2 lakh crore in terms of deferred license fees. So, you would think that when an amount that big was involved, the government would have been very, very quick to come up with a solution. But for whatever reason, the government till date has not come out with anything meaningful at all. This brings me to the issue that I've been discussing for a long time, that essentially there should have been zero license fees from 2010 itself. Keep in mind that 2010 is when the government of India started charging market prices for spectrum. So, it basically used to charge people license fee and spectrum charges when it virtually gave the spectrum free. So in 2010, when it started charging market prices for the spectrum, there was no reason to be charging the license fee at all. So if the license fee had actually been abolished in 2010, Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister then, or in 2014 when Mr. Modi had came to power, there would be none of this dispute, because if no license fee had to be paid, then whether telecom revenue included the interest earnings or not didn't really matter. So so the Supreme Court has certainly got it wrong in the way it has proceeded on the case. But even more worrying, more frighteningly, the government of India has got it totally wrong. Basically, like a deer caught in the headlights, it just freezes. So the government of India has sort of remained frozen. As I said, the first government was Dr. Manmohan Singh. Then it's been the Narendra Modi government as well. So that's bad news. So if the courts don't come up with a quick solution, 270 or 280 million or more, maybe 270 to 80 million subscribers that Vodafone has, these subscribers will be forced to port out. The government will clearly lose lakhs of crore rupees, which is a big loss to it. And the telecom industry will suffer very badly. And mind you, this is from one of the most decisive governments that we're supposed to have had in a very long time. It's a government that just continues to twiddle its thumbs as far as telecom is concerned, certainly. So that's bad news. In fact, an issue related to this is really the issue of how the economy is going to grow. Standard & Poor, when it retained India's ratings, basically said that the economy would grow at about 8.5% in FY22. So so the point that we've been making is, we make in our editorial, when the stimulus itself is small, a lot depends on how the government reforms. So if it's able to reform in a big way, then investors will start coming back, and the investment engine will drive the economy back. But as you know, the telecom case shows, and this is what we cite some other examples, there's a complete lack of reforms as far as the government is concerned. Now the good news story is that the HRD ministry has just come out with its rankings, on various parameters to look at the top educational institution in the country. Not surprisingly, the IITs continue to be among the top. And but the worry here is, in fact, this is what we talked about yesterday, is that the HRD ministry has actually not given much freedom to these universities for a long time. So as a result of which, these universities may be the best in India, but in terms of global rankings, they continue to slip. So we saw that yesterday. There are very few in Indian universities now in the global ranking. That's yet another example, and there are many such examples. That's yet another example of how the government is completely failing the country. Lots of other news that I have to discuss. The coronavirus seems to be, coming back again in the United States. That's the reason, for example, for why the Dow fell a lot. Household savings have gone up in FY20. The RBI has just told us. Obviously, it will go down and probably, I mean, we don't know how long it'll take to come back, but we'll just stop here. I think I've completely run out of time. And frankly, you've got the weekend coming up. So how much more can I depress you? Thank you.